Hey guys, today we're going to talk about how to get sub-20 on 3-blind. This is for anyone who's currently stuck and looking to improve, or anyone who wants to pick up the event and start getting fast. Before we get started, if you'd like to see more informative videos like this relating to 3-blind and cubing in general, consider liking and subscribing to show your support in this video. Alright, let's get started. Throughout this video, I'll be catering to people of all speeds. This is so I can help you regardless of how fast you currently are and give you all the knowledge you need to be sub-20 and beyond. I look forward to seeing you improve. I'll be assuming you already know how to solve blindfolded and memorize corners and edges and execute edges and corners, as this is what 99% of blinders do nowadays, and personally this is what I think is the best. The first and most important piece of advice I can give is to learn 3-style as soon as possible. Obviously, if you want to be fast, you have to use the fastest method. For now, we won't really worry about Memo too much, as execution is really what you're going to be working on throughout most of blind solving. Learning 3-style may seem daunting, but it's much easier than you think. There are already many resources on understanding and learning commutators, and I'll have some link in the description. And I have a video on my channel already about the best way to go about actually learning 3-style, so you can finish it quickly and with good enough algs to take you to sub-20. For some resources on useful sheets you can reference, I'll have a link to Max Hilliard's and Elliot Koplansky's sheets in the description, as they have really good algs that are easy to learn and most of which don't require super weird finger tricks to be fast with. Don't worry about optimizing your algs too much. As long as they're rotationless and aren't too long, they're most likely fine. Even top solvers that average below 18, including myself, still use some questionable algs for some cases, so don't stress too much about it. Obviously, learn your comms from UF and UFR, and if you already do know 3-style from a different buffer like DF or UBL, I highly recommend switching to UF/UFR as your primary buffer, as it will make your life much easier as you get faster and reduce the likelihood of plateauing. Make sure to obviously learn your parity algs as well for each targeted. Once you finish 3-style, your times will start to get much faster. You'll get more and more used to using commutators and solves and won't have to think about using them as much. Assuming you have decent algs for cases, you'll probably average about 50 or so with little practice. For now, I recommend you keep doing solved and keep getting more comfortable with using comms until you average about 45. Remember to prioritize not pausing in your solves, as it's going to save more time than if you turn very fast with lots of pauses. Memo will also start to get faster on average, since the faster your execution, the faster your memo will become, since you won't have to retain the memo for as long. Once you can solve comfortably under about 50 seconds, I recommend that you implement the next big change in your solves, which is one passing. One passing is where once you memorize the cube, you don't review it. This means once you memo a letter pair, you have to hold on to it until you execute the corresponding alg once you get to it in execution. And while this may sound really difficult, since your execution is already about 20 seconds or faster, you don't have to hold on to it for very long. You only have about 4 words on average for corners, and assuming you use audio for edges, you should have about 6 sounds to remember on average. If you're finding adapting to one passing every solve too hard, here's some tricks you can try. Try focusing on the first letter pair during corners. Usually the hardest part about one passing is remembering corners since you execute them last, so I found that if I can usually just remember the first pair in corners, I can remember the rest of corners much easier. You can do this either by really focusing on the first word in corners, or just quickly making an image associated with it in your mind that you can revisit. So for example here, my first letter pair is WD, which is wedding, so I might just think of a wedding in my mind that I can remind myself of when I get to corners. You can also try visualizing the last edge pair. Personally, when I started one passing, I found it really difficult to remember all 6 edge pairs on average with audio, so I would just remember where the last pair would need to go in my head. Personally, I really like this, and I still do it in all my solves now, and I think it gives good practice for when you start visualizing more of Memo later on. So for a quick example here, we have JWKMNYQLHE, and I know the last pair is going to be OB, but I don't want to have that added to my memo, so I can just visualize that the cycle will go here to here to here, so I won't have to add an extra letter pair into my memo. Alright, now that you know 3-style and are one passing every solve, great job. Those 2 things are really the hardest techniques to implement into blind and will take you further than any other technique. Now the biggest source of your improvement is just going to come from doing more solves. The rest of the video is going to be focusing more on tricks and techniques that will be slowly pushing your times further down, but everything I've told you is more than enough to get down to low 20 or sub 20 already. Blinders like Jeff Park and Jack Kai were able to get sub-20 just by doing lots of solves and refining what they already knew, not through additional tricks like floating. That being said, tricks are definitely going to help your journey to sub-20 easier, so let's delve into those. First of all, here are some alg sets that are really easy and will help you a lot. 2 flips and 2 twists. These are very common, so learn all of the algs for them regardless of where they are in the cube and if they involve your buffer or not. When you notice them during Memo, just remember where they are visually and don't assign letters to them or anything. You can find algs for them included in the sheets in the description. 3 twists. These aren't as important to have an alg prepared for each, as you can use a more intuitive way to solve them that Graham has a video on I'll leave in the description, but it can definitely help to use some already fast algs that you can find in the sheets mentioned earlier. Now let's talk about floating. In my opinion, you should absolutely use floating in your solves if you want to get sub-20 or beyond. It's easy to learn and grasp, and is a great way to not only lower your alg count and move count, but your memo time as well. Floating, if you don't know, is where you use comps from buffers that aren't your main buffer in order to save an alg during execution. So for example, here, during edges, instead of cycle breaking here, then finishing edges like this, you can save an alg just by doing an alg from UL instead, like this. And for corners, instead of cycle breaking here, then doing one more alg, you can just do one alg from UFL instead. You'll learn floating just like how you learned 3-style initially. Just come up with your own algs for each case and see what other people use for them. Eventually you'll have an alg prepared for each case from any buffer, so you'll always be prepared. Now learning floating from every buffer is not necessary for sub-20, but learning a couple additional buffers like the one in the U layer is extremely useful and I highly recommend it. Personally, my floating orders are UFR, then UFL, UBR, UBL, FDR, FDL for corners, and UF, UB, UR, UL, DF, DB, FR, FL, DR, then DL for edges. What algs you use for floating don't have to be perfect either, since you'll be saving an alg regardless during solves. It's more important to do an alg you don't have to think about a lot than perfecting each alg and pausing a lot in a solve trying to remember what you use. If you know you're coming up on a case while floating you don't have an alg prepared for that you're totally comfortable with using, just improvise a solution during the solve and review the case later. Now I'll talk a bit about improving your memo. There aren't really super important techniques for memo outside of not reviewing, and getting faster at memo will mostly come down to just doing more solves. There are some things you can implement, however. First, over time try implementing more visual memo into your solves. Memoing with letter pairs will always be slower than just remembering where an alg goes, so it's worth getting good at. In general, as I mentioned earlier, I always visualize the last letter pair in edges, and sometimes I'll visualize even more pairs, upwards of 2 or 3 in a solve. If I get just 1 or maybe 2 floating algs in a solve, I always visualize them instead of trying to remember a letter pair, as you could confuse which buffer you're doing the algs at and it'll just be faster. So for example here, we have here to here, and then here to here, and then we have a floating cycle from UFL. So instead of remembering like the letter pair HG, I'll just remember what this kind of case looks like for when I get to it in the solve. And as I mentioned earlier, I visualize all flips and twists. Another thing you can try is deduction during memo. So for an example of that, here we have these 2 pieces swapped. So what we can do is just kind of figure out that our targets will be here to here, and then here to here, because it's a 2 swap, and that'll save us from having to come up with letter pairs during the solve, which will be much slower. Another important piece of advice is when memoing, try to keep a continuous stream of thought, and try not to slow down or pause during memo, and get through it as fast as possible. While I'm assuming you use sentences for memoing corners, over time as you get faster, having a coherent memo for corners isn't really as useful, as you'll just be used to remembering your corner memo despite it being gibberish. So in general, don't worry about having super refined or logical memo for corners, just a memo that'll stick and is fast. For some general execution advice, don't worry about turning too fast. How fast your execution is isn't about how fast you can do each alg, but rather it's about reducing the time in between each alg. Obviously this includes reducing pauses entirely, but also thinking about minimizing things like regrips and doing things like cancellations in order to save moves in between algs. This is why I advise you not to time your algs. Timing can be good for cited events like for example PLL on 3x3, because you just have the one alg left in the solve before you're done, and you want it to be done the fastest and most consistent you can. However, this doesn't translate to blind, as you have lots of algs to do, and you will likely lose time by doing each alg as fast as possible than if you thought more about how you were going to go into the next alg. An example of this could be grip cancels. So for example, we have here to here, and then here to here. Both of these algs start with your hand like this, so once we do the first alg, instead of going back like this, we can save the regrip by just starting the next alg like that. So it would look like this. And then we can also cancel some moves here too. In general, just focus on having a really strong flow. In order to have high TPS, you should be focusing more on reducing lockups and pauses than trying to turn super fast on every alg. I figured I'd talk about hardware near the end so that I don't cause people to worry about hardware until they are already committed to blind, and since personally I don't think hardware matters much since most 3x3 nowadays are all pretty good, and what cube you use won't really hold you back. But here's some popular options: the GTS3M and GTS3LM, the WRM 2019, the RS3M 2020, and the Tengen. I've used all of these and had pretty good success. I'm mostly switching between the GTS3M and the WRM 2019 at the moment, but again, hardware doesn't really matter. Lastly, I'll end with advising you just to reach out to other blinders. Not only to talk about any questions you may have or find additional resources, but to make some friends along the way. Some popular places include Facebook groups like Cubix's Friends or Blind Support Group, or some Discord servers like r/Cubers. And that is all. If you have any additional questions, please comment them below and I'll try to get to them as soon as I can. I left out some more advanced topics like parity shifting or alternate pseudo-swaps, but everything in this video is more than enough to get you sub 20 and beyond. If you'd like to see more advanced 3blind content or general cubing advice, please show your support in this video and I'll consider making more. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'll see you guys next time.